Good afternoon. See here, let me get your names. So this week we are working on the progressive movement, which the chronological lines for which are a little bit blurry, but I would arguably say the progressive movement didn't really uh, catch a lot of speed until the 1890s. It really took wind in the 1890s, and in the first, at least first decade, if not first 2 decades of the 1900s, really took off. And I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at the introduction to it, but imagine that you have by now. Um, but notice, right, that it's difficult. It's kind of nebulous trying to put together uh, a lecture on the progressive movement because it was so many things. It constituted so many different, wings, uh, and some people say that it was so much that it almost becomes nothing as far as trying to put it all together into a common definition and a common group. Um, let's see here. So I have 9 of you. I have you. That's great. So I have all 9 names. Uh, but nevertheless, what I will say I feel like are somewhat safe generalizations from what I've read on the progressive movement. Now, of course, some of the typical sources I usually use, I try to go left and right as far as Howard Zinn, as well as Larry Schweikart and Paul Johnson, their history books. Obviously, our Alan Brinkley textbook. Um, then I also am looking at the old, as far as one of the provocative arguments or theses in your argumentative assignment is Richard Hofstadter, right? His Age of Reform, and he writes American Political Tradition. He has a couple interesting chapters on Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Again, American Political Tradition. Richard Hofstadter wrote back like in the 60s. It's older stuff, but it has stood the test of time. I also oftentimes incorporate A Fierce Discontent by Michael McGarr. I'd highly recommend that if you have the time and money to look into this stuff, but it's certainly not required for the class. And then also Standing at Armageddon by Nell Painter. All right, so those are some of the sources that I'm using, have used when I give this information, right? So at any rate, with the progressive movement, generically, right, a couple things that they tended to share is one is a sense of discontent with the status quo of the Gilded Age, right? The late 1800s, they definitely saw room for improvement, for reform, right? Um, Regarding the state of things in the late 1800s, and so the state of things, a couple obvious things, right? One is what we've covered, Howard Zinn type information, right? With number one, if you're going back to your Gilded Age argumentative assignment, number one, that the economy was arguably too laissez-faire in the late 1800s. The government was not regulating arguably enough, and the big corporations were gobbling everybody else up. And especially when they were engaging in behavior that seemed to a lot of people, when it was revealed by the progressive muckrakers, it seemed to be unethical, unfair, and that it ought to even be considered and made illegal, right? Like we talked about the Lakeshore deal secured by Rockefeller, where he guaranteed, right, a transportation company. He guaranteed them a certain number of tons per week of oil. I don't remember if it was crude or refined oil. And in return, because they could charge him per pound, right? And so he gives you 6 tons a day. That adds up to a lot of money that you could charge Mr. Rockefeller. So in return for providing that tonnage of oil, right, he was to receive a rebate, a reduced price per pound for his oil to be transported that his competitors did not receive, right? So it gave him a clear advantage over his competitors. And of course, he collaborated with some of his competitors in getting enough oil, right, to do that, and so forth. And so we talked about that, the trust, right, whereby big businesses were combining, all or some of the following, some of their stock, because things were shady at the stock market at that time as far as going public. Some of their capital, some of their resources, their connections, some of their business contracts, combining them with one another at the expense of the smaller guys who could not compete, right? And we talked about that, how when you have more capital to work with, and you could streamline your production, you can make it much more cheap, right, and efficient, and then you could put your price lower than your smaller guys could afford to go and undersell them, right, and just through economies of scale. And so we talked about this, right, and how the it just seemed like without a lot of regulation and government intervention, that it just seemed unfair. It seemed, you know, immoral. The way that these quote robber barons just absolutely monopolized, took over their entire industries, right? So we talked about Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel, James Duke with tobacco, Cyrus McCormick with farm equipment, right? And then later on, you'll have your, Henry Ford with automobiles, etc. And so, at any rate, to the progressives, right? This concerned them. This consolidation, right? And not just consolidation, but what happened along with that, right, was the disparity of wealth. You look at incomes at this time, right, as best as they can before an income tax in the 19 teens was established at the federal level. You look at different information to try to surmise, the allocation of wealth, right? How well it was distributed, etc. And you find it to be completely imbalanced, right? My goodness, I have the stats there in your argumentative assignment, but it was not pretty, right? As far as like the top, certain very small percent of the population owning over half of the nation's wealth and assets, right, in property. I have here the top 1% controlled 88% of the nation's assets at a given time around 1900, in the height of the progressive era. So at any rate, the progressives, they looked at this and said, okay, we are not happy with the manner by which the industrial process, the second industrial revolution, has unfolded. We think that it's unfair. We think that it's unhealthy. And also, right, shared in these books is the notion that the progressives felt like that phenomenon was combustible, that they were literally afraid of a class war erupting, especially right between the capitalists, the big industrial business owners, and the proletariat, the manual laborers who worked particularly in the industrial sector, in the factories, right? And then they seem spaced out, but supposedly, some of these labor strikes, right, in various industries seem to be very telling and very concerning to the contemporaries, right, of that time. So you have the 1877 Great Railroad Strike, right? You have a big one in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in the Gilded Age. You have, of course, the Homestead Strike and the Pullman Strike in the early 1890s. You have the Cyrus McCormick Strike and the Haymarket Square affair outside of Chicago in, gosh, was it 1887? And so, So all this in the Gilded Age, right? Supposedly a lot of concern. Um, when you look at, like I said, if you look up look into the Pullman strike, Pullman, and the railroad strike of 1877, look up their scope, right? Some of that I had put in the Gilded Age assignment handout, but look at the scope, the number of states that were involved in these strikes, the number of strikers that were outside the industry from which the strike arose, right? So, like the Great Railroad Strike, you had people coming out of factories unrelated to the railroad, blowing stuff up and attacking strike breaking Pinkertons and National Guard soldiers. So, to a lot of people, right, this was emblematic of like a sense of a pent up rage, right? Howard Zinn mentions this in his book, right, along with the race issue, that it was there was this subterranean underground rage about the injustices that were suffered for the common person, that all was needed was just a simple trigger, and people would be set off by the thousands across the nation. And when you look, right, what's interesting to me is like Standing at Armageddon, etc., is, as well as Richard Hofstadter's books, is they make a big deal about the 1890s in particular, and also about the 1877 railroad strike. That prior to this, you find a lot of evidence amongst journalists, within the field of the attorneys and lawyers of the country, right? Amongst in the pulpit, amongst preachers and pastors and priests, religiously. And they say that you see a very noticeable, sharp turn in their rhetoric, in their public stance, about the Gilded Age, right? That seemed to very quickly and radically turned after these big events of labor strife, of strikes gone violent, right? So that before, right, the kind of before and after dichotomy that they paint is that before you see them being much more conservative, that the laborers and their employers have basically the same interests, right? That their interests are not at odds with one another, that they're certainly not at war with one another, that the capitalist system is inherently benign and fair, right? And that everyone was meant under capitalism, right, to pursue his or her own self-interest, but that somehow it works out, right? The invisible hand secures overall justice and equilibrium and equality of opportunity for everyone, right? And then you see suddenly a change in some of those professions, some of those people that I mentioned, right? And not to mention also university professors, right? To a much more concerned, even kind of militant mood, right? That they expressed in their lectures and in their writings, etc., whereby they began to exude uh, an anti-capitalist, anti-employer, anti-robber baron for sure sentiment, right? Whereby they began to believe that at least some of what Karl Marx had written about the capitalist system might be true, that it might end, if the government doesn't intervene, in an unfair, unhealthy oligarchy, right? A rule by just a few robber barons who are controlling entire industries at the expense of the majority of people who are gobbled up as far as small time bourgeois competitors, who are marginalized or kept down without opportunities as their laborers, right? And so you see much more, kind of, for lack of a better adjective, militant calls for change by these groups, by the pastors, by the attorneys, by the journalists, right? By the professors, the leading professors of the late Gilded Age. And what they call for, right, at the very least, is more government intervention, right? Excuse me, I'm sorry. Is more government intervention. So For instance, there's a popular call for the government to prevent trust-like activities, right? When big businesses are trying to collaborate at the expense of smaller competitors trying to compete with them, that such should be regulated and that such should be prohibited by law and even punished, right? And so there was a big push for an antitrust law, right? Also, there were concerns about the opportunities of laborers to rise. Right, if you look at some of the stats from your Gilded Age assignment, it is collectively somewhat agreed upon that a family of about five, right, about average about three kids, mom and dad, needed close to $700 a year, at least $660 a year, just to subsist, just to survive, right? But when you look at the average salary of an industrial laborer, it oftentimes is about $260 to $300. And an agricultural laborer, same thing, uh, less than $300 a year. That's less than half of what was needed for a family, right? Miners, sometimes they can make up close to 500 at the very most, but very hit and miss work. Certainly not year round in most cases. And so only in the case of year round could they make up close to possibly 500, which often did not happen. But even in that best case scenario, right, that's nowhere near $660. And so you needed multiple incomes per family, right? And like I said, that was, I think those per year estimates included the assumption, which was not to be made, that you worked year round because cyclical layoffs were very typical, according to multiple sources in the Gilded Age. So workers simply were not making enough money. And so they were having their children leave at a very premature age out of public schools and work, right? Child labor was typical in the Gilded Age era to help, contribute to the family funds. Very sad case with a woman whose life became broadcasted eventually. Her name was Rahel Golub, RahelGolub. She was from a Russian Jewish immigrant family, and you can see, just look her up and find evidence about how she had to contribute and work her bottom off at a young age as a young girl, and heaven forbid she asked her dad if she can keep some of that money. That was the most selfish thing she could have done in her culture and her circumstances, her time period. And of course, she contended that she never again asked, right? As far as giving and sacrificing for the common good of her family and getting her other relatives, her sister and mom, over from Russia. So at any rate, right, you have families in this predicament, whereby the progressives began to believe that they were stuck. They were stuck in kind of a cycle, if you will, an environment of poverty from which they could not extricate themselves. So many of these progressive intellectuals that I had mentioned, right, they began to push for minimum wage legislation, workers' compensation for those injured or laid off, right? To help them for that. They began to push in turn for anti child labor laws to try to keep the kids in school so that they could have hope of ascending the socioeconomic ladder one day instead of being kind of pigeonholed and stuck into a factory or farm job from the time they're 11 years old. So they pushed for legislation as such, right? They also pushed for legislation for collective bargaining, for the bosses to have to recognize the labor unions of their workers and to have to come to the bargaining table with them regarding, conditions, the conditions under which the workers worked. And another common platform held by progressives at this time period was for an 8-hour day, as well as a minimum wage and workers' compensation and collective bargaining, right? Also, the progressives agreed that something ought to be done legislation wise to guarantee the quality of goods and products that were being produced by the robber barons in particular, right? Because what the notion was through exposés and journalism, uh, the especially the big companies, right? They were cutting corners to save money, of course, cutting corners and at the expense of the quality of their product. A very kind of demonstrative example of that was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right, where you have mice and rats falling into the vats that grinded up the meat for bologna and hot dogs, and those rats are getting in their flesh, right? Their bodies were getting grinded into the sausage meat, and the bosses found out about it and did nothing about it because, again, stopping that and making precautionary steps, it took away from their profits. It kept the assembly line from rolling, and they didn't want to make that short-term sacrifice, right? And so, the typical examples later on, like lead put in paint and for cribs of children, and children's little babies and toddlers suck on and bite the crib wood that has the lead paint in it, and it harms them. So for the progressives, right, they wanted legislation that guaranteed the quality of products that were being made in the factories, right, to protect the consumers, the American consumers who were ignorant and unaware of this until those exposés publicized such information. And so notice, right, generically, the progressives did not think the invisible hand of the market was sufficient in ensuring equality of opportunity and fairness in the economy, right? As far as opportunities go for advancement, for chasing after the American dream. So hence, by and large, progressives to this day, right, Hillary Clinton and others as liberals contend that they are progressives and from the progressive movement's tradition, right, and legacy, is they believe that more government intervention is necessary, right, in the economy, especially on behalf of those who are marginalized, those at the bottom, right? They contend that they're looking out for the underdogs in the system. They're looking out for the casualties of progress, right? And of course, casualties of progress, as the name implies, are those who have been a bit gobbled up by the second industrial revolution. So small time entrepreneurs who are trying to run against the Rockefellers, right? Good luck with that. Industrial laborers of the proletariat who seem to have had a bit of a glass ceiling, right? We use that term oftentimes with women and minority groups, glass ceiling, right? That the boss doesn't necessarily have to have an overt law that states, these demographics or these positions cannot receive a promotion, cannot receive a raise. They just simply don't do it, right? And so hence the term glass ceiling. You can't see it, but it's there. And so progressives, by and large, want bigger government. They want bigger government, by and large, in their rhetoric at least, right, to help out the underdogs, the casualties of progress, those who need the help, right? And also, right, progressives were concerned about just the health of society as far as culture, habits, behavior, interactions amongst different demographics, right? They wanted, so for instance, they did not want certain demographics to lose hope, right? To the progressive movement, hopelessness is dangerous, right? And this is where they borrow from sociology, right? Where you look about like cycles of progress. I'm sorry, cycles of poverty, right? Where you have sociologists go into the ghetto areas of East Harlem in New York amongst poor Puerto Rican young men, and you see this sense, all the way up at least to the 1990s, of this hopelessness, right? That why should I stay in public school? I won't get accepted into college. I won't make it in the job force. I won't be accepted, and I won't rise up the ranks, even if I, tried my utmost. And so I'm going to go, I'm going to attain my American dream through illegitimate means, right? I'm going to sell drugs. I'm going to join a gang, et cetera, et cetera. It's become a bit cliche, but that's the sociological argument, right? Of environmental circumstances causing and perpetuating people's poverty status. And so the progressives, they wanted to give hope to all demographics, right? And of course, their motives varied. To some were rather brutally honest and said, "We know that despair, a lack of hope, leads to criminal activity, and I don't want these poor immigrants." Because we talked about, right, in Gilded Age assignment number 2, the Southern and Eastern European immigrants, generically entitled the new immigrants of the late Gilded Age, right, particularly Italian, etc., coming in such large numbers into New York, especially, and Jewish, them finding their own, kind of self help from. We talked about from people in their own ethnic group, like the Jewish community with the cloth industry, right, and the vending industry. We talked about Italians getting contracts through these middlemen coming from Italy, especially in construction, right? And so, and then also we talked about them having connections with political bosses and political machines, right? Boss Tweed, right? Whereby they would buy the votes of these immigrants. They'd say, hey, we'll help get you a job. We'll help provide you connections to medical care and or, some kind of, help that you need. But in return, on election day, you're going to vote for our corrupt guy from our political party, right? So this had all been largely exposed in and during the Gilded Age, and so the progressives, they didn't they wanted to end these cycles. They wanted a healthier environment. So they wanted the Italian immigrants and others. They wanted them to have hope and not despair, so that they would not, facilitate political corruption through the political machines, so that they would not join gangs and engage in criminal activities, like the famous 5 points, etc., right? And, etc. You had also the Chinese here in California, early on, the Tongs, establishing human trafficking with Chinese women as prostitutes. And so, all this is being perpetuated during this time, and the progressives try to fight all of this, right, and give hope. So you have the settlement house projects, right, which were very interesting. You look up at Jane Addams and Lillian Wald, and they come into these ethnically homogenous, kind of marginalized areas, right? Remember, marginalized is that you're kicked to the corner. You don't have the same rights and opportunities as many other people do, and you happen to be ethnically homogenous in your neighborhoods. Not to be cliche, but think of like Oakland as an African American, marginalized city, of certain areas of Oakland. So at any rate, you have those areas in Chicago and in New York and in Detroit, etc., right? Especially in the East Coast. And so these educated women would come in, right, as nurses, etc., and teachers, and they would come in and they would provide these kind of Salvation Army, right, because they were modeling after Salvation Army back in England, facilities. They would provide, just a something as simple, seemingly simple, as recreation sports and playgrounds for the young poor immigrant kids, just to get them off the street, get them away from enticing temptations like drugs, alcohol, gangs, whatever it might be, right? And to keep them focused, right, on whatever this sport might be, and then it might piggyback from that sport, right, onto something else offered at that facility. And of course, at that facility, they offered classes and education, right? They offered skills, job skills. They even had employment agencies whereby they would give you a type of a skill test, right? And find out what your strengths and weaknesses were. And from that, accordingly, try to contact a local employer to get you a job. They provided, something as simple as room and board, bathing, showers and baths, um, uh, uh, babysitting, taking care of your children, right, etc. They provided these things free of charge to these immigrants in these dilapidated areas, right? They tried and worked for them to get stuff as mundane as like garbage disposal, access to water, running water, and sewage, right? Because all of those were relatively new in the Gilded Age, as known as kind of new, burgeoning urban problems, as cities just blew up in numbers during the Gilded Age of the 1870s through 1900. So, at any rate, right, um, these um, these settlement house workers in these settlement houses, they received a lot of publicity, okay, as trying to help out and give hope to people that were seen to be marginalized, stuck in cycles of poverty. All right, I've been talking for a while. Are there any questions or comments?
Not for me. Just
Okay,
listening.
no problem. Thank you for letting me know, Polly. All right, so I take it no one else.
Just listening.
Um,
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. You were saying that the quiz on Sunday, that the information should be found in chapter 20.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so I mean, needless to say, right? I have no problem philosophically, and I have no way of enforcing it. I have no problem with them being open book. To me, you look stuff up, you study it, you find the right answers, right? The most appropriate answer. You're doing the work, and I'm fine with that. So by all means, take that quiz open book, and yes, right out of chapter 20.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Hello, anybody else? Okay, so thank you for letting me know that you're doing well. And again, Canvas message me should you have any questions. So looking at this handout then, right? We're looking at let's see here. Uh Court history of the progressives, right? Remember COURT, that praises our nation's leaders, right? Like a king or queen who asks his or her court scribe to write a history of him or her and of his or her kingdom. It's going to be glowingly, laudatory. It's going to praise them, right? Um, in the selection of facts, presentation of them, organization of them, etc. So with court history, right, they're going to praise these progressives as altruistic, right? Putting the needs of others above themselves and their own needs. It's going to praise them as being heroically altruistic, as some people called them at that time period, do-gooders, right? The do-gooders, these progressives. And so again, right, what they try to do is they try to combat what they thought were injustices, inequities, imbalances of the second industrial revolution and the Gilded Age, right? Or more generically, problems, what they perceived to be problems of the Gilded Age. And they took it upon themselves, right, to try to ensure that those at the bottom got government and private help, encouragement, and protection, and those at the top got proper regulation, and if need be, even public punishment, right? So I hope I'm amply clear on that, okay? Because like I said, it becomes difficult because there's so many different wings and facets of the progressive movement that it's hard to define all of it together because they were all so variegated, so different, and in different fields and had different agendas and crusades. But to me, that generically stays, okay, is they try to improve or resolve what they perceive to be problems, inequities, unfair facets to the second industrial revolution. And it oftentimes involved, right, more government intervention, bigger government to regulate, in particular, big business and to legally ensure uh, better opportunities, right, and rights for the laborers as well as for the smaller competitive entrepreneurs or business owners. Did someone have a question? Okay, so feel free, okay, at any time, chime in and ask me a question. I'm fine with that, as I would be if we were in class.
Could you give me an example of like an institution that or progressive movement that like would be an example of that today? I mean, do we still have that sort of analogy? Like do we still have people that believe that way today?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a great question. Okay, I think that is a great question. So, really, all those same fields, you see them alive and well as issues today, right? So you see, movements to help out the marginalized, right? Those that are chronically unemployed. You see that again in the private realm with your religious and and more secular private things like YMCA, Salvation Army, right?
Okay.
The local gospel mission place, right? Them trying to get people on their feet and get them a job and give them hope. You absolutely see that. Not only that, right, Polly, but the assumption that 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 criminal activity, right, and other types of behavior are largely environmental. That assumption from sociology, I think we still carry with us, right? So, for instance, um, juvenile hall and a separate criminal system for juveniles, right? The progressives brought that about because again, they said, right, these poor immigrant kids and African American kids, they don't have any hope, and that's why they're committing these crimes. They don't know any better. They're young and uneducated and out of school, and so hence we should not punish them like we should an adult, right? And we
Okay.
ought to, instead of being punitive toward their crime, we need to redirect them, right? We need to give them hope and training and rehabilitate them. And so, the types of different systems we have now with the juvenile system and treating juveniles separately for their crimes and giving them programs, right? For them to be educated and have school while they're in the juvenile system and engage in different societal things, something as simple as picking up garbage and other types of environmental endeavors that some of them are supposedly forced to do or have the option to do to this day. That's all very, very progressive.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
No, no problem. And if you don't mind me elaborating a little bit more, like I said, I mean, the other facets as well, right? As far as, minimum wage laws, trying to strengthen labor unions and their right to collectively bargain with their bosses, right? Workers' compensation laws and all that for laborers. That certainly is alive and well as an issue today, right? Um, Goodness.
How about
You know,
the
all,
opposite end, like the top end? You know, when we regulate the top, and sometimes you said they're punishable too. Like,
Absolutely, absolutely, right. And speaking of that, Polly, is taxation, right? This is definitely alive and well today. This was novel for the progressive time period, right? Is it was always assumed in American political tradition that you were never to be punished for your allegedly merited success, right? The whole success ethic, rugged individualism, right? Turner's thesis with the West, right? You look at those ideas of meritocracy coming from English political tradition, coming from the Enlightenment, right? That if you if you have somehow earned your success, you certainly should never be punished for it, right? With the
Yeah.
progressives, right, they challenged that assumption and said, wait a minute, some of these people, their success has become excessive. They literally have begun to make too much money, where it has become harmful to the rest of society.
I
The manner by which they have so inordinately lorded it over their competitors, right?
yeah.
And so notions of, I kid you not, an excessive income tax in some states, like under Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, under Hazen Pingree in Detroit, Michigan, under some of the socialists here in California in the early 1900s, right? They wanted, if you made past a certain income, they wanted a large, disproportionate tax on it,
Wow.
contending that you have made now too much and it has become harmful to the rest of society. Okay. And so, generically, right, we call those graduated taxes, right? That not only, right, if you just did a flat tax, let's say, right, of like 7%, well,
Mhm.
7% of a million is a lot more than 7% of 50,000. So
Right.
clearly you're taxing the millionaire more, but there's a sense of fairness to it, right? Because you're taxing just 7%. But
Right.
in a graduated progressive tax, right? You say, no, I'm going to charge 12%. When they go up into a higher income bracket, I'm actually going to charge a higher percentage of their income, right? With that kind of notion that they're making excessive money, and it somehow is going to become parasitically dangerous to their contemporaries and their competitors and others, right?
Where they can control more, like per se, just have more control and.
Oh yeah, and see that's the common. And so you mentioning the word control, Polly, it makes me think of the conservative argument that you see in number 3 on your handout this week, right? Is the conservative criticism of the progressives, is that they have gotten away from the ideal of meritocracy that our founding fathers, so many of them adhered to, right? that
Yeah.
that you rise or fall by your merit, by how hard you work, by how intelligent you are. And the complexity of this issue, right? I tried to show that in the first Gilded Age assignment, right, on number 4 or
Yes.
so, that
Mhm.
I call it, right, giving the devil his due.
Mhm.
The degree to which Rockefeller and Carnegie, right, the degree to which they made very wise decisions. They worked very diligently. They did certain things to arguably earn their success, right? That made them stand out from their competitors. And so that's what we see on number 3 in this week's assignment, right? Just to kind of ruffle your feathers and get you to think, and just to see what you have to say about it, etc. I kind of put together number 3 with a smile on my face. But absolutely, that argument, right? That progressives are kind of, for lack of a better term, that progressives are kind of haters toward those who win, in a perhaps un-American, unfair manner. And so, absolutely, you find that on number 3. And then, as you might guess, I try to be as broad as possible and as fair ideologically as possible. Then number 4, I take a 180 and I defend the progressives, right? And so look for a defense of the progressives on number 4, and talking about cycles of poverty, right? And things that the founding fathers perhaps didn't think about in their generation, uh, as far as the need for people at the bottom of the pyramid to be fed hope, right? And
Yeah.
remember, go ahead, Polly.
No, I said yeah. I was agreeing.
And so remember, it's so one, right, is remember that of course to some of the progressives, they wanted to see the results. To them, right, more equity, like as far as income, of all Americans and all demographics. when you have a more balanced equity or distribution of wealth, that is just healthier, right? And so to many of them, they genuinely wanted to see these impoverished people receive jobs, get paid better at their job, have their job more securely established, right? And the conditions healthier and more lucrative and more promising for them, just for its the end result, right? The clear the economic end result. But to others, right, there was more of a perhaps a less healthy, less altruistic concern, and that was just as long as they have hope, they will not rebel. They'll be less inclined to start a big bloody strike like in 1877 and 1894, right?
Mhm.
That as long as they have hope, they'll be more docile. They'll be more willing to go to their job day in and day out and so forth, right? And so you have a more cynical thesis of some people, right? That contends that to some, they think at least some of the progressives, they just wanted to give the American public um, catharsis, right? And remember, catharsis is like hitting a punching bag. They wanted to give them release of a negative emotion in a benign or non-harmful way, right? Getting
Right.
that anger out in a non-harmful way. And so, what better way, right, than publicly punishing the robber barons for everyone to see, right, and be happy about,
Oh, okay.
right?
Yeah.
I think of it. This is silly, but if you'll indulge me, as an elder brother uh, of 4 years over my younger brother, I remember in times, abusing that age difference in authority and size, right? And then at times getting public punished by my parents, and my brother just smiling from ear to ear watching it, right? Like he needed that, right? Like, okay, good, older brother can't do anything he desires, right, when mom
Yeah.
and dad are gone without at least some repercussions. Well, you have a case, right, with Teddy Roosevelt, whereby his administration issued an antitrust suit against the Northern Securities monopoly in the railroad business, and it ended up breaking that trust up, right? Well, J.P. Morgan, a part of that trust, he was furious. He allegedly came to the White House and told Teddy Roosevelt, right, is this what I'm to expect with all of my investments? And Teddy Roosevelt supposedly, according to Hofstadter, right, reassures him in a conservative manner behind closed doors and says, hey, man, I'm not that radical. You don't have to worry about me breaking up all your trust and all your businesses, right? But he says, when you are glaringly um, uh, stopping competition and the public is becoming infuriated about it, you have put my back against the wall and I must punish you for all the public to see,
I have
right?
a question.
Yes.
So when you're talking about the progressives and their and wages, were they looking more for people to make like everyone kind of be paid kind of the same? Were they looking to raise wages and everyone be making? I mean, I realize they want everyone to be able to make a living wage, but
Right.
did they want that for companies to raise their what they pay people, their the you know what I'm saying, like
Yeah.
they, yeah,
Yeah, no,
so
that's a great question, and I don't know if I have a definitive answer to that, but what I can tell you, right, is on the far left of the progressive wing to this day, right, are those who adhere to some of Karl Marx's writings and his beliefs, right? So, for instance, you have the socialist, right, and the socialist, they I call it kind of diet communism, right? They say, okay, well, certain things like access to public transportation, water, electricity, and utilities, etc., right, should not be based upon merit, your ability to pay, but should be unconditionally considered a right for everyone to have, right? And they realize that some won't be able to afford their electricity, etc., so someone else is going to have to foot the bill. So to the socialists, they're getting away from the notions of meritocracy and the workers earning their wages to more of a sense of parity, right? That, like you asked, like everyone more on just simply equal footing.
Right.
Needless to say, those who went further to the left than the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, the syndicalists, they wanted, absolutely, they wanted to do away with class differences. They wanted parity for all workers, right? And you see that to this day as vestiges of the progressive movement, right? Those today proverbially on the left will go that far to the left, right? Whereby they are unapologetically aiming for parity, for just equality of condition, right? Not just equality of opportunity, like the founding fathers preached, but equality of condition, equality of where you end up being in your conditions, right?
Well,
And
isn't
that
that kind of
is,
where Europe's at? Don't they have more like they pay less, but everybody has they're given more by the government.
yes. And matter of fact, and I wish I could tell you more about that. But every time, every kind of liberal professor I've sat under, or anything that I've read, almost always points in particular to the Scandinavian countries like Sweden. So absolutely, and some of our again, some of the liberal, contingent to the further left, they are aware of that, and they do want to emulate countries like Sweden, Scandinavian countries that are technically socialist.
So isn't that going to take away from people working hard, going to college, getting jobs that pay more? Does that kind of take away from that idea of, like you work hard, you make more money, you go to college, you get a job that pays more?
Absolutely. And what
That's
you were stating, right, is what I try to convey on number 3, is that
Okay.
that absolutely is the conservative
I'm sorry, I
argument.
haven't read that yet. I
No,
was
it's okay. It's okay. No, absolutely. No, I'm glad you mentioned it, so I could tie that to number 3 and have you remember that when you go to read it. Is absolutely that is the conservative argument, right? And I tried to be fair and do number 4 in the form of a liberal argument and be balanced, but absolutely, that reminds me of what I tried to put together on number 3. The common arguments from the conservative side, the right side of the spectrum to this day, right? Is that far left part of the progressive movement, which you see to this very day, that it kills and it denies meritocracy, right? That you are to get what you earn, what you work for, what you merit, what you deserve, right? And that not only that is un-American, right? Because supposedly the founding fathers had written so much about that, etc. But that to some people, right, like you mentioned, it's incongruent with human nature. That if you have 2 kids and you're leaving town and you tell both of them, right, okay, I want the lawns to be mowed or this or that to be done, right, as far as housework while I'm gone, and I'll allocate the money to you when I get back. And you come home and you find out that, only the younger sibling did all the work and the elder sibling did nothing, and you pay them the same nevertheless, right? The notion is, good luck in getting the younger sibling to carry that workload a second time when he or she noticed, right, that elder brother or sister got the same for doing nothing. And you find that right with Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. If you look up the Kulak farmers, Kulak, when he began to pay them the same according to the size of their families, absolutely irrespective of how much they were farming, they began to react in ways that you're saying that kind of support the conservative argument, right? Those who are working their bottoms off and receive very little, they stopped working. They said, well, what's the use? I have no incentive. And so
so.
they stopped.
I have a question then, and I hate to always bring it because I know we're learning history and I always bring it back to present, but it just helps me kind of understand where we're at and where they were.
No, absolutely. Don't ever apologize for that.
Like,
Like I said at the beginning, history is supposed to be useful and relevant.
like I told you before, when I took your course last semester, I didn't know any history at all. I was just duh. And so I could
Oh,
never have a conversation about anything. I would always have to listen. But I didn't even know what Republican and Democrat meant before your class. I learned so much and got into politics. But like
oh,
when
thank
you
you.
take something like, it just seems like with history and today, we're still fighting the same battles, and they're
Yeah.
just at a larger scale. And basically, from what I've seen, and then to to talk more about that, what you were explaining to Aaron, that like the raising the minimum wage right now, like after we've gone to school and we've worked hard to make this certain amount, and then if they raise it, and then it's like, well, why do we have these debts when we're just going to start out at 31,000 and they could make that, and but you don't want to penalize them. Minimum wage should be higher, cost of living's higher, but it's just such a fine line, and I can see where you have all of the people, the reactions from people and how they are conservative or progressive and what they think about socialism and conservative.
Like I totally agree with Polly on
Hmm.
that, and it's like I feel like you said, like I read all the stuff that you've been posting, and it just seems like we're doing the same thing over and over. Like no one is learning from
Yeah,
what happened before. And if
Yeah.
we raise minimum wage to $15 an hour, how much is my hamburger gonna be at McDonald's? How much
now.
do I
Yeah,
pay for my kids' Happy Meal when I'm going through the drive-through at McDonald's?
Mm.
Like it's going to be $20 because they have to make up that money somewhere. Like, the McDonald's guy is still going to want to make a profit.
Yes.
I just
Yeah.
have the utmost respect for everybody we speak of in history, regardless of what side they were on, because they were out there trying to make it work for everyone. So
That's right. And yeah, and just to balance you guys, because for all you know, I could be more conservative than the arguments you're making right now, personally, but that's irrelevant. It really is in this class.
I like the
But
way you teach that. You let us come to
Yeah.
our own decisions. Love that.
no,
It's
I absolutely, I
that's
could not believe more that way. I really couldn't. But to balance what you're saying and what you just mentioned, right, is that absolutely, like to this day, I think of the progressive movement when I think of the further left of the spectrum, like Bernie Sanders, right, and
yeah,
some of the very arguments he's making and his rationale. I just kind of smile. I'm like, that guy's a progressive, a
love
bit
this.
of a hardcore, leftist progressive, but he's definitely in line of the progressive tradition. And it's so fascinating, like you said, how so much of the discourse, the topics, the debates, the stands, the rationales for each side, it's crazy how much of it has not changed, right?
Yeah,
Even though the individual circumstances, right, and with, for instance, technology and the type of production and all that,
yeah,
have historically evolved or changed, so much has not changed in a
yeah,
hundred years.
Well, and
yeah.
is it a bad thing that Rockefeller was making that much money because he was working for it? Why is it? I mean, I can see where people were upset then because he had so much money, but still, if he's working and he's built a company, those
Mhm.
people worked for their companies. I think I wrote that in one of the things that we wrote. One of when we were evaluating the stuff that you posted. Like, I don't see it's an issue if you're the owner of a company.
Mhm.
And I mean, like, my son was friends with one of the Gallo kids. They made a big company. They've built a big company, and I don't see a problem with that. I don't
Yeah.
see that, working hard and building a big company that makes a lot of money, that, that's not anyone else's fault or problem or.
No, absolutely. And I love this, you guys. I love it. And though that argument you're making was made during the Gilded Age, right? That both on ethical term, that it was they won fair and square. That's the American way, you know, but also on practical terms, right? Whereby they would say, they would even go so far as, like with the Gallo brothers and with Rockefeller, right? That those people were able to to streamline production so well that they keep the price of wine, they keep the price of oil low for the
Low.
common
Very
consumer. They provide jobs for tons of people, right?
Mhm.
And and you also get the contention again, like I mentioned lastly, right? That the progressives, some of the progressives just felt like they needed to give catharsis to the common people.
Right.
That the
Okay.
people that there is something inherent, especially in American political tradition, maybe arguably, but perhaps just in human nature, that we hate to see the same people, overwhelmingly win, even when the competition is fair, right?
Yeah.
Again, I probably use terrible analogies,
It
but
can
I
be.
finally, at 44 years of age, I finally have come around where I could be happy for the success of Tom Brady, right? And I can honestly say,
I was just gonna
what has that man ever personally done to me, right? I just don't like that he has won so often.
like to
It
see
just bothers
someone
me,
win. Yeah, that is so good. Yeah, exactly.
and
Those are
so
the ones that work hard and they're the best at what they do. And God, I like that tennis player that they asked her, "Are you going to retire now?" It's like, what? That was rude because you're older and you're not winning as much. I mean, God, that was rude. But you know,
yeah,
Serena Williams. Yeah.
yes. I
You
have
know what
friend
I mean?
Jesse. I still hate Brady always. Oh, trust me, Jesse. For years, I could not stand seeing that guy win, and I would tell my wife, I'm like, I know it's irrational. I've never met the man. He's never
Now,
done anything to me.
wait
But
a
I'm
minute.
just tired of seeing that man win.
Did he beat my Rams 2 years ago? Was that Brady? Did
I'm
he beat
sorry.
the Rams? Did Tom Brady beat the Rams? My Rams?
He
Was
did.
that?
He
Yes.
did.
Yeah, I don't like him either, Jesse.
Yeah, he just won again this year, right? Just beat the defending champs, Kansas City. But at any rate, right? And so it is. It is. It's fascinating to me too. And I love this, you guys. By the way, ladies, just the participation. I love this. I would absolutely love it if we were in class. Um, I would kind of, only half jokingly say you could interrupt me anytime. This enriches the class, uh, without a doubt. But so absolutely, right? I hope that we're on the same page then, right? As far as the argumentative assignment this week. So you have court history that praises the progressives as these altruistic do-gooders, right? Who are trying to give hope and opportunities for those who are proverbially at the bottom and trying to hold accountable the ruthless guys up at the top, right? And then, of course, you have the notion that what they are standing for is un-American, goes against human nature, perhaps is not fair, particularly to those who are successful, right? And so the conservative argument to this day that challenges the progressive movement. Then, of course, you have the progressive counter argument, right, about cycles of poverty and culture of hopelessness, and how they need to be pulled up and helped, right, and given that extra help, albeit by either private agencies and do-gooders, right, or by the government at whatever level, city, state, county, or federal. And also, right, before I forget, there was one number in particular. It's a Hofstadter thesis, okay? And that was the status anxiety thesis, right? The status anxiety thesis. And that was, right? It's basically Hofstadter says, look at the change you see from the 1870s to the 1890s in some of the leading progressive classes of people. And like I mentioned, lawyers, right? Attorneys, preachers, journalists, professors, right? Um, small entrepreneurs, which that's easier to see their grievance, obviously, right? Getting gobbled up by big business. But at any rate, right, he contends that you look at these demographics in the 1870s and 80s, and their their agitation for change was very minimal. And he says, what do you know? By the 1890s, you see a big turnaround. Now suddenly they are at the forefront of the progressive movement, especially advocating regulation of, and even punishment of big business. And his thesis is very simple, although I feel like he does a great job in elaborating on it. And that is that there was a status and income and power revolution during the Gilded Age. The clear winners were the robber barons, right? The Rockefellers and the Carnegies. And these gentlemen, by and large gentlemen, right? Because women were also part of the progressive movement, but usually not as attorneys and professors, etc. But these gentlemen, right, lost in that revolution. They, even if they were not impoverished, even if they were still attorneys and professors that were making, $3,000 a year when, 660 was necessary. So they were still living comfortably, or even up to $10,000 a year. They weren't making, millions a year like Rockefeller, right? And making, in the span of a decade, over $1 billion. So relative to big business, they were losing, right? And there became a status revolution, not just an income, right? But they began to be accepted by and large in the local uh, commerce, the commerce committees, right? For business. They began to be, asked to come to the universities to give a lecture, etc. They were always spoken about, written about in the newspapers, etc. That their status overwhelmed that of this old middle class, and this old middle class became envious, became jealous of having lost that prestige, right? Even if their income hadn't diminished relative to big business, they had something to be jealous about. And so, hence, there's a degree to which, again, for lack of a better term, I apologize, they were being, as progressive leaders, haters toward big business, right? And all too happy to begin these crusades against big business. Okay. And then, as far as selfish motives, remember the other one that I had mentioned, right? Is that arguably some of the progressives maybe became afraid of a class war and of criminal activity from those beneath them, particularly the quote immigrants, right? And so some of them may have been for pushing to give the immigrants hope, to get them into these settlement houses, right? And keep them preoccupied and give them a future and a vision for their lives, right? So that they would become less inclined to form a rebellion, to engage in criminal activity against their sons and daughters on the streets, etc. Right? So I thought that was interesting and worth mentioning as well.
So I have another question.
Yeah.
What was it that they wanted to happen to the big businesses? Like, if they were angry with them because of what they had, what did they want to see happen?
That's a great question. I think of like Teddy Roosevelt, right, versus Woodrow Wilson, as far as the mainstream progressives, not those on the far left. Because remember, those on the far left, you look at like Henry George, you look at the writer Upton Sinclair, you look at a guy named Edward Bellamy, and others that were considered more radical, right? They actually wanted to just demolish big business. They wanted to take their feet out from underneath them and to either have government regulation and government control over the key industries, because again, some of them were downright Marxist and that far to the left, or they wanted simply, like Woodrow Wilson said, for the mom and pop businesses to have a chance again, right? By taking all of the connections, much of the capital and the access to rebates and special privileges away from big business to give small businesses a hope again. Because remember, they felt like that was more American, it was more ethical and fair, and that it was more healthy, right, for the American public to go back to a decentralized capitalism, right, of mom and pop shops everywhere and in all industries. That
So
was
they wanted
healthier.
someone like Rockefeller to have his business completely broken up. And
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, even someone as seemingly mainstream as Woodrow Wilson, who became our president in 1912 to 1920, even Woodrow Wilson advocated that in his 1912 presidential campaign. He wanted to see the Rockefellers, he literally used the term demolished, broken
It's
up.
it seems like today, like if I could guess what they tried to accomplish that would have been like propaganda and media, or just turning to get people to turn against them, because there's nothing really else they could do but affect public opinion. Maybe, I don't know, but that's another story.
No, no, and yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an intelligent,
Oh, you always have an intelligent answer.
no, I don't, and especially right now. But I'm again, I really am, Polly. I'm glad that you made that comment. Like I said, I love this. This enriches this video and our class meeting together. This is wonderful.
Well, I
Okay.
know that in the past history, you've mentioned a lot where they used, the stories, and the journalists wrote and spread the papers, through small towns to get, their, you know, crusade out there, and their ideas and opinions, and so that's why I was just bringing it up.
Absolutely. And remember, right, for the test, in case it's on there, the term used for that kind of expose journalism, right, was called muckraking, right?
What was it?
Muckraking,
Oh, okay.
MUCKRAKING. And those who did so were called muckrakers, right?
Ooh,
They
I'm
would.
gonna bring that term back today.
I would love that. I know. I love that term. To this day, I love that term,
Some
and
of our people,
especially because the reality of muckraking is still relevant today, right? It still happens.
like,
It's still true to this day. Why
what do
not?
you mean?
Why not revitalize that term?
Let's make it a trend on Twitter tonight. Hashtag that.
Right. That sounds good. So absolutely right. So you had muckraking. You had those right who like I mentioned, Upton Sinclair in the meat packing industry, and it got a response, right? Shortly after his expose on the meat packing industry, Teddy Roosevelt very ostentatiously, right, because some people believe his motives were mixed. Teddy Roosevelt went forward and had the Federal Meat Inspection Act pushed through Congress. They called it his MO that he followed, right? They called it the bully pulpit. He would go before Congress and tell them, here's what the public needs. Here is a clear, injustice that's going on. The public clearly, for this and this reasons, is demonstrating that they're not happy about it. So now I put it in your lap. What are you going to do? Because if you don't, I'm going over your head, Congress, and I'm going straight to the press and to the people and telling them that you're not doing your job. So that's the way Teddy Roosevelt tried to put pressure on Congress to pass progressive legislation, right? And he did that, and he got the Federal Meat Inspection Act passed, right, with the FDA, and then have to approve the process of the meat packing, and like I more generally with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, right? So with food and drug production, there have to be certain sanitation policies that have to be followed. There are to be regular and unannounced visits from the Federal Bureau, right? And they make very micro demands as far as we need a vent here, we need a cleaning agent in this, we need that they would get very, they have the right to this day to get very specific in what they require for health and sanitation reasons for us as consumers of those
As they
food or
should.
drugs. What's
Yeah,
that?
as they should.
No,
They need to
absolutely,
get
right?
those.
Absolutely. That it really, it seems like, that facet of the progressive movement, protection of consumers from harmful products being made, right? It definitely seems to be less combative, less argumentative, less polarizing today. A lot of people just kind of take it as an axiom. You don't question. Well, yeah, of course. They should have done that a long time ago. So yeah. So you have that, right? Trying to think of another example. Ida B. Tarbell, she wrote about the abuses and the conspiracies of the robber barons to get secret deals, right, with their trust activities. And that may have arguably led to the Clayton Antitrust Act under Woodrow Wilson, whereby it arguably put teeth in the old Sherman Antitrust Act, whereby they had a list of exact examples of what constitutes trust activity, price conspiracies, getting reductions on transportation and storage rates. It gives it gives an exact concrete list, so it makes it more arguably easily enforceable, right? Um, you have exposés on the railroads by a guy named Stannard Baker, and then you are going to get the Hepburn Act under Teddy Roosevelt, and whereby he is going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission, where railroads have to give the same rates, and those rates have to be, quote, reasonable and just for all customers, right? And so, believe it or not, until then, that was not the case. And so the government actually started setting price ceilings, saying you shall not charge more than 33 cents a pound as railroad companies, right? To any industry, to any client. And so that was so if you look at a lot of this muckraking, right, it in many cases, it arguably received or generated immediate legal responses, right? Where public anger, public indignation over that issue put enough pressure on politicians to do something about it. And then, of course, as I have mentioned in the handout, there was a guy named uh, Jacob Riis, and he had a book along with photographs called "How the Other Half Lives." If you're ever interested in looking at that, just the absolute impoverished, unsanitary conditions of immigrants living in New York City, living in the infamous 5 points, and just take a look at that, and it'll tug your heartstrings. And what do you know? Right after that, Teddy Roosevelt, as the governor of Tennessee of New York, it put pressure on his state legislator to pass a housing act that secured certain requirements, right, which are relevant to this very day, right? As far if you're going to rent as a tenant who lives there, or in as a business person, you're entitled to know, right, that that place that you're are inhabiting is not a fire hazard, is not amenable to some kind of toxic gas infusion or an explosion or some type of collapse and fall, etc. Right? So all the intricate housing codes that are enforced to this day and building codes, right, began arguably in response to Jacob Riis' muckraking work, How the Other Half Lives. So it's fascinating.
Example of a progressive movement? Is that an example? Was that an example of the progressive agenda?
It is what, hon?
The housing?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's I'm glad you asked, but absolutely. Yeah, that was definitely part of the so you see what I mean when it becomes a little bit difficult to define uh in aggregate the progressive movement, because there were so many different fields and agendas and so forth, right? And just at one more example, if you'll indulge me, this is just kind of my perfectionist side, and I'm thinking, okay, well, I never mentioned this part, is also progressives were concerned about the apparent falling away of their generation from Victorian culture. And remember, like Queen Victoria in England in the late 1800s, right? Victorian culture was very in tune with Judeo-Christian values, right? From Judaism and Christianity, in particular, very, to this very day, it's used as an adjective, right? If someone is Victorian, in particular as it pertains to sexuality, it was very conservative. Women were to be women, and they were to be chaste and upright, and men were to be highly penalized for their sexual indiscretions, and families, nuclear families of mom, dad, and the kids were to stay intact, right? Um, and you were not to become too ostentatious and too materialistic, et cetera, right? And to the progressives, they were concerned that all of that was going to hell in a handbasket during the late Gilded Age. Divorce rates went up, evidence of men and exposés, at least, right? In muckraking journalism, exposés were showing evidence of a lot of middle class men seeking the the company of prostitutes after work, um, all kinds of things, right? That caused a sense of alarm amongst progressives. So there was a social arm, right? A completely social or cultural part of the progressive movement, right? That focused upon morals, etc. So it fought to try to make divorce more difficult. It tried to keep families intact. It tried to keep men monogamously faithful to their wives and against prostitution, etc. Right? It tried also. There was a notion, right, that as the well-to-do men were prone to see prostitutes in the big cities, the factory laborers who were barely getting by and working their bottoms off with their hands, right, in the factories, that they were seeking solace at with the bottle, right? There's a book called The Alcoholic Republic that applies to American consumption of alcohol in the 1800s, and it's pretty sobering as far as they get into stats, as far as aggregate consumption, and it gets up into the billions of gallons being consumed by Americans annually during the late 1800s. And so, not to mention just unsanitary. If you'll indulge me, one facet of this is that you could go into a bar, right, in New York, etc., Chicago, and you would pay 2 pennies, and they would have you drink from the same hose everybody else did, and you could drink as long as you could hold your breath and drink in one setup or whatever, and then you had to pay more money. But they drank from a common hose, right? They had places commonly where they would put, especially in New York, right? Because the expose journalism, we know this, where they would put those who were drunk and had passed out. They would literally have sections of the bars where they would put those who were passed out. They had, kind of a raucous entertainment, if you will, according to the exposés of these journalists. For instance, we're talking about metropolitan New York. They would somehow get wild animals into that place, shipped into that place, and they would have bear baiting, where they would have multiple dogs fight to the death against a bear, and people would gamble on it and entertainment, etc. Right? So it was like alcohol was tied to all these different vices at one. Um, Also, not to be super dramatic, but I kid you not, when you look up the 5 points and you read on it, right, some of the exposés spoke about and provided evidence for um, these these murderous plots. I kid you not, whereby people would be lured, especially the men that were well dressed, were lured by prostitutes up into these certain apartment complexes above the bars, where people were waiting to kill them, take the money from them, and they actually had architecturally, right, in these apartment complexes, because they were eventually bulldozed and razed in the name of urban blight, right? But they actually had chutes in the coming that went into the Hudson River, or even crevices into the wall where they would dispose of the bodies.
Oh my God, I'm
Like
so.
it literally became like systematic for like
Oh.
that just this system, for lack of a better word, that was maintained, right, by these gangs. It just seems stranger than fiction. It really does. And you look at some of the names of the gangs, and you're like, really? The Plug
Interesting.
Uglies, the Oh gosh, there are several just outrageous names. Of course, the what is it, the like the Gangs of New York movie, the rabbits, right? The dead rabbits, etc. I mean, there was some truth to some of that. When you look at that old movie, it just seems like hyperbole. But some of that crazy stuff, there is progressive journalism that exposed it and supposedly verifies it. So, and then not to mention what I didn't mention also is that the more obvious ones is domestic violence, right? That some men were getting drunk on their way home from working a 12-hour day, 6 days a week, and they were engaging in domestic violence when they got home. And then some people were coming drunk or hungover to work, and it was affecting uh, their efficiency as workers at the workplace.
One of the
So,
biggest issues would have been probably that their family suffered financially too, wasn't it? Because
oh,
they
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And I'm sorry I didn't mention that, but you're absolutely right. That's a given. Is and that clearly was mentioned by the progressives, right? That every drink bought, by a poor, despairing laborer took food out of the mouth of his kids and his wife. Absolutely. And also, right, the notion that women uh, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the whole separate spheres paradigm was still strong, right? That women are inherently more virtuous, but more fragile and less practically capable. I say that laughing because it couldn't be more opposite with me and my wife. But that women, right, were less practically inclined, less capable of being independent and running their own life on a day-to-day basis, and in need of a man to take care of them, right? More fragile emotionally, but yet more virtuous in their hearts. And so, hence, right, that Mother Nature that God intended and society ought to go that direction for women to stay in the private sphere, stay away from the world, don't go out to the workplace, but keep their virtue intact in the home and imbue that virtue onto their children in rearing or raising them, right? So that whole separate spheres argument was still very strong at this progressive time period. But you find many women, right, particularly the well-to-do women, who find themselves kind of in a state of limbo, right? Like Jane Addams and others, right? Whereby their father gives them a decent degree of wealth. They were beginning with Oberlin College in Ohio in the mid 1800s. Colleges and universities began to accept women more and more. So now you get a group of women that are getting a college education. They have some money, they have some leisure, right? So that they can live from day to day and are not in need of a breadwinner. So what do they do with that education? What do they do with their time? What do they do with their good intentions? So a lot of that type of demographic of women led, not just joined, but in some facets led the progressive movement as key speakers and organizers and patrons with their money, right? And so as they began to go on speaking routes, on speaking tours, etc., right, they began to ruffle a lot of feathers, saying, wait a minute, women are supposed to stay at home. Why are they getting involved in this political issue, right? And so what some of them did is they tried to make it more palatable, right? So that men would be willing to metaphorically swallow this and accept it, right? To make it more palatable, some of them uh, they continued to use that separate sphere stereotype and said, well, we're women, right? So of course we're concerned about immigrants because we're the more compassionate sex of the two. We're women, so we're worried about other women being, impoverished and harmed by their husbands when they drink this alcohol or when they go to prostitutes, right? We're women, so we are against child labor, and we believe the children ought to stay in school, and we feel protective of them, etc. Right? And so that's how you might make the argument. Some do, and this is subjective. This is argumentative, okay? but some make the argument that some women very shrewdly entered the public realm of politics, right, and of the progressive movement uh, through arguably the back door by still trying not to ruffle feathers and saying, well, I'm a woman and this is my sphere of interest. This is my sphere of influence, right? Over these quote moral issues. Because after all, right, women were upheld to be under Victorian culture to be more uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Virtuous. And men were, it was taken as an axiom that men were pigs already, and there was not much you could do about it but punish them. All right. And so, along with that, women are really going to be strong in the temperance movement against alcohol. If you look up the Women's Christian Temperance Union, again, Women's Christian Temperance Union. And remember, temperance means moderation. So technically, they were for just people not getting drunk and not imbibing too much alcohol. But in reality, oftentimes it seemed to be more abstemious than that, that they were just trying to get rid of access to alcohol, period. Because people tie the temperance movement to later prohibition, which of course was against alcohol consumption, period. Right? So when you look at that, look up a woman named Carrie Nation, right? Carrie and then nation, like country. What an interesting woman, an elderly woman. She went into these saloons in Kansas and began preaching the Bible and telling them that they were doing the devil's work and serving the alcohol. And she had been a part of a relationship previously with a man who was an alcoholic and was physically violent. And she was a tough elderly woman, and she became somewhat of a celebrity and fighting against alcohol, especially in the Midwest of the country. And so a lot of Bible Belt countries, Georgia, Alabama, Oklahoma, right, the Carolinas, went dry, virtually went dry. And then some like Tennessee and others, right, in Colorado, they went on a basis of county by county basis, right? But the temperance movement, yes. Anybody have a question?
Would she be considered to be part of the women's suffrage kind of era?
You know what? Shame on me for not having an answer to that. I apologize. I am not aware of any direct links with her and the suffrage movement. And remember, everyone, the suffrage movement, right? Suffrage is the right to vote and run for office. And but a lot of women a lot of women, their interests were interconnected. They were broad, right? And they also did so. Like I said, I'm embarrassed to say this. I would not be the least bit um, surprised to learn that she was supportive of the suffrage movement, but I just have never read of her having any direct links with it. Okay, I apologize for that. But again, when you look at women right at this time, with Frances Willard, you look at Susan B. Anthony, right? Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? Of the mid to late 1800s. And they definitely, right, as women that are connected to the suffrage movement, they were definitely connected to a lot of these progressive agendas that we've mentioned. Anti-alcohol and domestic abuse, anti-child labor, right? Um, the rights of unions to unionize, etc. A lot of them entered a broad array of these crusades that were collectively called progressive, for sure. I just sadly don't know if Carrie Nation did, because she was so deeply ensconced in this anti-alcohol crusade that was what she was absolutely primarily known for. And as you may know, right, the women are finally at the end of the 19 teens going to gain the right of suffrage, right, through the amendment process. And boy, is it going to be a tough one. And I think, I believe we go through some of that and mention that when we do the Roaring Twenties pretty soon. But progressives, right? You would think progressives were by and large, because it was a progressive movement, women's rights, they were a bit split on the issue. Again, you look at someone like Woodrow Wilson, who served as our president, right? He was very, kind of arguably to the left when it came, at least to his rhetoric, not necessarily what he did as president, but what he stood for in his speeches and in his writings, right? As far as being an anti-big business progressive. Nevertheless, he, by today's standards, showed a lot of evidence for being, almost a misogynist against the women's rights movement and the suffrage movement. So at any rate, they're in there. So at any rate, are there any other comments or questions?
I'm happy you're feeling better and your family's doing well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. Something as basic as just not even feeling like $1,000,000, just feeling normal. You could just function from day to day. I no longer take that for granted. I'm just so delighted just to feel normal. So yeah, thank you. And I hope you guys are safe and take it seriously. I know many of you are young enough that you may not have to worry about this COVID at all. But you just never know, because I don't feel like I'm that relatively out of shape, etc., and unhealthy. And with myself and with some others, it could hit your lungs very, very seriously. So yeah, just be careful. All right. Well, I love meeting with you guys. I really enjoyed this class. No, go ahead.
I say our kids are going back to school too next month.
Yes.
It's kind of scary. Yeah.
Yeah,
Even the high
it is.
schools are going back.
I'll
Are
be
we-
darned.
Phone calls.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole asymptomatic carrier thing, right? With the
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah. The elementary schools, I got a call saying they're going back full time. And then we found out today high school's going back 2 days a week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that. I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but that is news to me. I
Yeah.
didn't definitively know that.
Have
We
they,
Wow.
just found out today.
have they mentioned college yet?
No, I didn't hear that. I just heard what Modesto City Schools was saying.
Yeah, and I too have not heard anything yet with college. We're on a just wait and see, status still.
I remember the last class I was in before they called it quits during the beginning of last year. And I remember as the teacher was talking about it, I looked down at my desk and thought, oh my God, I could see like just weeks of sweat and dirt and pencil lead just caked on that desk. And I tried to hold my breath as long as I could before I got out of there. And I was like, boom. And then the next day, we don't have to come back. I was like, woo, okay.
Yeah.
Scared. So
Yeah,
what do
I think definitely after this COVID, we are all going to be collectively much more germ conscious, aren't we?
yes, we are. So, but I was very worried about you and your family because I know you're a healthy person and you take care of yourself from what I know, and I was really surprised that you got that sick, and I was just really worried. So I want to give you my best and say thank you for
Well,
teaching
thank you.
me back.
Thank you. And that means the world to me. Thank you so much. And I mean that. And so, you guys really though, like I said, I don't have to say this. I love this class. I've gotten where I look forward to this Zoom meeting. I really do. But if there's if there's not any other questions.
I do have a question
Yeah,
regarding the test. So
Sure.
the test, just to make sure, is on chapters not chapter, but chapter 20, and everything can be found there. And I feel like I saw that it was on something else as well, but I can't remember.
Okay, so first of all, right, with the quiz, I think you're talking about with chapter 20, it should be up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead and go and remember that, I never put in a time limit. So by all means, look through it as long as you need, right? And open your book up and take it open book. And also, you using the term test, I'm glad that you have done so, because it reminds me that I want to either put up the test itself of test 2, or at least a study guide for you in the next couple days, to give you guys ample time, to give you weeks to prepare and to know exactly what's going to be thrown at you for test number 2.
Yeah.
And that will entail, right, overseas imperialism, the progressive movement, Woodrow Wilson in World War I, and the Roaring Twenties. It will entail all those topics.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah, study guide would be
That would be
useful.
great. Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
I do learn a lot more, even like I don't stress and I'm able to retain the information the way that we did these quizzes. So I appreciate that. And I know it's, may not prepare us later to be hardcore test takers, but at least we're getting what you're teaching us now. I think we're understanding and remembering it. And that's what's important, I think, moving forward. So
No, I
love
appreciate that. I appreciate that. But I still also, like I said, I mean this. I I love to optimize your chances of doing well in my class. So by all means, during times like this, I'm becoming a little bit familiar in my memory with the test at large and with the specific questions. So to try to convey everything that needs to be conveyed for your success on those tests. But in addition to that, absolutely am open to study guides. Study guides, if not even the real darn test itself, letting you take a look at it weeks in advance. I'm all for that. I'm perfectly fine with that. Remember though, however, what normally I'll think about it, but normally I only allow unlimited submissions for test 1. So if I undergo the normal course of events and my normal habits, test 2 and 3, you're just going to have one shot at them. Okay. I want to give you that warning.
Okay.
great. And I appreciate it. You are so intelligent, and when you put your questions into like to I don't know. Sometimes I have to really read it because your verbiage is so like sometimes I have to look up a word, and so I like when you put it in the parentheses and you tell us what you mean. Sometimes when you assume that maybe we don't understand a word, I love that because then I don't have to go look it up. So I
Oh
appreciate
no. So
that.
I'm gonna pay Polly later, guys, for her
No, do you
the
know what I
compliments.
so
But
much
no,
here?
I you having said that, I think that helps me make up my mind as far as because we all do, any instructor for that matter, right? We all have our own verbiage that we use and the manner by which we kind of format our questions. Because of that, and because I have my own quirky style, I think I would like to show you the test itself rather than just a study guide. So be on the lookout for that. Okay, I'll post under modules. I'll post test number 2 very soon.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Because I wanted to make, from my understanding, the tests are always everything that we've been learning, while the quizzes are just the chapters.
That's right. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, the quizzes are meant to be simple. There are only 5 of them, and they do not pertain in any way to, at least they don't intend to the argumentative assignments, to any of my lectures or our discussion. They're just isolated book information, and the test is supposed to be all encompassing. The test is
Okay.
Yeah,
supposed
it
to,
took me
encompass everything.
yeah, it took me longer than it should have to realize that.
No, that's all right. Like I
Like
said, we all have our own styles as
like
teachers.
I said, it did that to me in the beginning of the first semester, and then I understood where he was going with everything, and I got used to his teaching, and that's why I'm here a second time because now I get it. So that's good.
Oh, good. And it makes me happy. And like I said, yeah, just, I think that's the case with any instructor is, you have to kind of learn their quirks, their style, of teaching and their philosophy. So I hope it's becoming more clear for everyone.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Good. Good,
It
good,
works.
good. Thank you. Okay, and so are there any last minute questions or comments before I let you guys go? No?
Not at this time.
See you next week.
Yeah, and so like I said, I don't have to say this. I really exceptionally look forward to this class's Zoom meetings. You guys are great. You really are. I love it.
Yay, thanks.
All right. So, but you guys have definitely served your time. For the duration of this, goodness, we're beyond an hour and a half. What I think I'm going to write down is I think I'm going to give you guys a couple extra points, more than 5, for how long you've hung around. Okay.
Awesome.
So no, you
Thank you.
absolutely have earned it. You deserve it for sure.
It was a good lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just a great
They
topic.
help.
That's what it is. It's just the topic is interesting. So thank you guys so much. You guys have a great weekend. Okay.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Don't forget about your quiz. Okay. Your textbook quiz.
Okay.
And be on the
Take
lookout
care.
for that test number 2. I'll put that up shortly. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
Thank you. You guys
Thank
be
you so
well.
much.
Okay.
You too.
Thank
You
you.
got it.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.